On behalf of Shifa Center of Professional Excellence, I, Tanya Noreen, welcomes you all. The global pandemic of COVID-19 has transformed the infrastructures of education. So, to comprehend the impact of COVID-19 on education sector of Pakistan, I would like to invite Ma'am Izza Farrakh, who is currently working as Senior Education Specialist at World Bank of Pakistan. So without further delay, over to you, ma'am.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Izza Farrakh. I work as a Senior Education Specialist at the World Bank. Prior to that, I've had about 20 years of experience working in the development sector with a focus on education. I have worked on multiple education reform programs within Pakistan and outside of Pakistan, focusing on access, equity, quality, and governance issues in the education sector. And I welcome you all to this discussion. So this discussion will be it'll focus on the impact that we have felt through COVID-19. When we think of a pandemic, we think of immediate health impacts, but as we know, and local and global studies have shown that not only has there been a major economic impact, especially on the vulnerable and on economically marginalized communities, but a major impact also on schooling. Schools have been shut down across the globe to prevent spread of COVID-19. And today we're just going to talk a little bit about the impact that this has had, immediate term impact and potential long-term impact as well. So I'll start over here. As we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has turned the education world upside down. I'm going to quote something from my country, the World Bank's Global Director for Education, and he said that the COVID-19 pandemic has turned the education world upside down. We are living through a massive disruption in the lives of millions of students, teachers, principals, and parents. And I'll follow this up with a little bit of information on what we mean by turning the education world upside down. So the pandemic has actually caused major interruptions to schooling across the globe. Schools started shutting down from February 2020, and there was a major school closure till August 2021. There was 128 days where education systems were on average across the globe fully closed for, this would be about about 6 academic months if you count just the days the children are going into school. And the world's poorest children were disproportionately affected. Some countries were quick to put into place models that would allow children to come into school safely, sanitizers, social distancing. Some of them had taken extreme measures to come up with learning pods, others enforced masks, etc. But we saw that in low to middle income countries, the schools were fully closed for the longest because school systems, especially public school systems, didn't really have the infrastructure and the systems to support social distancing and introduce protocols that will allow the students to safety. So if you look at this is a World Bank analysis of UNESCO data that I've presented. And if you look at South Asia, it has had the largest numbers of days when schools were fully closed, goes above 200, below 250. So estimates are at about 210 to 120 days where schools were fully closed. This is far above your global average of 150 days. And if you see, it is especially above the developed world, East Asia and Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, and North America. And these school closures have actually had a spillover effect on learning levels. And while we are just working with preliminary data right now, we can see that, for instance, in South Africa, grade 2 students incurred learning losses equivalent of up to 70% of a year of learning. That means, in any given grade, they only learned 30% of what they should have learned in that particular academic year. In India, one particular example says that only 16% of grade 3 students could perform simple subtraction in 2020, compared to 24% of students in 2018. So that also shows that learning levels took a major drop as a result of school closure. In Netherlands, students lost the equivalent to 20% of a school year. But if you again see the comparison between Netherlands, which is a very developed country with Asia and Africa, you can kind of see how the pandemic has had the impact on the developed world has been much harsher than in the developed world. In Latin America, there's an example from Sao Paulo, Brazil, where students learned only 28%. Compared to if face-to-face classes had continued. So this responds to what students learned through distance education. A little more information on, what the detrimental impact is on children and youth beyond learning. So, schools we know are places of learning, but they also offer opportunities for socializing. They offer opportunities for parents who may not have childcare, to have their children looked after, especially, both parents work during the day. And they also provide, in some school systems, they provide, there's this schooling has, provides meals, they provide other, sports, athletics, they provide extracurricular activities. So, the schools go beyond just educating our children. Statistics are showing that 24 million additional students will drop out of the school system as a result of COVID. And we'll get to potential reasons why later. 370 million children in 150 countries missing out on daily school meals that are provided to their schools. 10 million more girls will marry early as a result of economic issues. Potentially financial instability in their families. So they'll marry earlier between 2020 and 2030. 10 million girls is a very large amount. We also see that the potential decrease in re-enrollment and increase in dropouts could amount to $17 trillion of loss in future income. 9 million additional children who have dropped out would be at risk of being pushed into child labor by the end of 2022. Again, this has to do with the economic impact of COVID-19, especially on your socioeconomic classes. And then, social isolation, lockdowns, etc., has the potential to cause 100% increase in depression and anxiety symptoms in children globally. So this is some of the fallout that we expect and have seen as a result of COVID-19 lockdowns. Getting to Pakistan. So, when February 2020 was the first time when schools were closed in Pakistan, it was one of the first countries in the world to institute widespread school closures. Since started end of February, followed by the rest of the country in mid-March. And at that point, I think we were all fairly optimistic. We thought this would potentially happen for maybe a couple of months before life resumed to normalcy. But here we are, 2 years later, from February 27, 2020, and the future of the pandemic and its impact on us is, we still don't really see a way out. So at that point in time, in early 2020, there were about 50 million children who were enrolled in school, and school closures meant that 50 million children in the country were out of school. Federal and provincial governments made a lot of effort to introduce distance learning programs, but we understand the scope and the accessibility of technology, even television. So the students who actually needed learning continuity the most, because they were already vulnerable in terms of what they knew and their ability to actually engage with, private sector technology. Those were the ones who had least access to public sector distance learning programs. In poor families, we know that, there would potential to have television, and especially the internet is very, very limited. And even if there is television, there's one television per household, adults, older children get access to it. And, the internet is barely available. We also saw a study done by the World Bank in Punjab saw that girls and younger children were less likely to have access to technology and hence engage in remote learning, even if the programs were really effective. A large number of the programs were also television-based, which obviously doesn't provide the opportunity for interaction, engagement, and it doesn't pace itself to individual, absorption and learning needs. So, initial feedback revealed that, while students did watch that, retention of the content displayed on television was limited. An organization based in Punjab called the Idara Talim Agahi, they did an initial study assessment of the impact of COVID-19 in Pakistan. The study is a little old now, it's a couple of months old, but what it showed that girls experience greater learning losses than boys during school closures across all competencies. So we're looking at various subjects and various skills that they learn in these subjects. And as we all know that, if you're not going to school, not only are you progressing in the curriculum, you also tend to forget what the knowledge that you had accumulated, right? So not only did this halt learning in students, it also basically contributed to regression, especially in girls who, again, we see that even if distance learning is taking place, girls have less access to technology. When you compare public schools, government schools to private schools, you see that children who attended government schools show greater decline than learning in private schools during the period in which schools happen. And these declines were particularly acute in lower classes. That is especially worrying, right? Because if children are not able to develop foundational learning skills, they have a really, really weak base upon which they build future learning gains, right? And if children are performing poorly in school, we've seen that they lose the motivation to continue schooling. So not only does this affect students coming back to school and re-enrolling in school, it also affects what, the strength of what they will learn and retain in future classes. During school closures, even though distance learning possibilities were available, the study shows that about 60% of children currently enrolled in school spent less than an hour a day on their studies during school closures. And while 40% of children with smartphones in the home use these for learning, younger children receive less time to access these than older children, which does make sense, right? Also, 55% of children in the study felt uncomfortable and underconfident to study on their own if school closures reoccurred. They said that if school closures reoccur, we will not be able to study well on our own, and that also applies to the fact that without an instructor and without the adequate level of pacing, children are not able to absorb and keep abreast of the content as it progresses. So, while the long-term effect of COVID on the education system and on learning and schooling levels is yet to be measured, because we don't know when the pandemic will actually end, preliminary information shows that an estimated 930,000 additional children are expected to drop out from both primary and secondary education. A key factor in a study in Punjab, and that applies to actually the rest of the country and global evidence as well, influencing dropouts was the loss of household income. Over a third of households in Punjab reported that they had lost a substantial share of their income, which obviously means that the costs associated with schooling, such as uniforms, stationery. In low-cost private schools, it also impacts textbooks, etc. And then you have other associated costs such as transportation to school. With loss of household income, those become the first costs that families actually cut. So, and again, the females are more affected by these financial expenditure cuts in families. Given that 22 million children in Pakistan, according to estimates, are already out of school, the 930,000 additional children expected to drop out represents an increase of almost 4.2%. And Pakistan is the country across the globe, the one country where we expect the highest dropouts due to the COVID crisis in relative terms. Even the most optimistic scenario suggests an overall loss of learning for every child enrolled in school. Estimates suggest that school closures during the pandemic will result in a loss of between 0.3 and 0.8 years of learning adjusted schooling for the average student. So when we mean learning adjusted schooling, we mean, the number of days where learning actually takes place in the academic year. getting to my final slide, the government is supporting, making a major effort to return to school, but we will understand the long-term impact of COVID-19 losses over the coming years. Another quote from Jaime: many students, particularly secondary school aged, who have been disengaged from the education experience for almost 2 years, might now be working, and they may have completely lost the connection with the education community. Again, if they were to come back, if you look at the complexity of the curriculum at the secondary school level, having been out of the school system consistently for 2 years means that it's going to be really difficult for them to be able to re-engage in the content that they were engaged with 2 years ago at this point in time. Learning levels will substantially drop, and two consequences of this: children may not feel the need to continue to go to school. They may not sit for their board exams because they know that they will underperform. And even if they do take their board exams, they may not perform well, decreasing any potential for them to find gainful employment. The government is considering aggressive targeted communication to ensure that children come back to school, supplemented by instruments such as conditional cash transfers, stipends, especially for girls and marginalized students, to promote attendance and retention. Once students come back to school, schools will have to be really nimble and quick to adjust the teaching and student learning interaction to compensate for learning losses over the past 2 years and get students back to the right level of learning. They may have to prioritize what they teach. The curriculum may have to be prioritized as well in schools. They may have to just rush through content just to make sure that children are able to get back on track and learn what is really valuable in terms of not just passing their exams, but also the competencies that they need to acquire for their grade levels. And also, we have there's been a lot of observation on the psychosocial impact of lockdowns and the frustration for families, especially those that have learned that they have lost substantial income. So schools will have to be safe havens, and teachers will have to be prepared to kind of provide that kind of psychosocial support to students while they return to school, and encourage children to stay on, because there may be domestic pressures, again, financial, social, etc., that would make schooling very precarious for students, even when they do come back to school. So this is the end of my presentation, and I think it's a good time to go to the chat and see what some of the comments were. So the first question that we have over here is from the question for me is my query. This is from Fazli Wahid. My query is, what will be the effect and outcome of this online education on future medical education, especially doctors? Well, I'm not well equipped to answer that question, but one of the things that we have observed in the public and the private education sector is that there has been an increasing understanding and acknowledgement that investments in distance learning need to increase across the public and the private education sector. So we see a lot of investment in infrastructure in government, by the government and the private sector, to make distance learning more accessible, engaging, more less dependent on a third-party instructor or facilitator. And there has been a lot of growth in the tech space, not only to support learning within schools, but also to support learning for those students, for those children who cannot access schools. So, predictions, not my predictions, but the studies that we've seen is that these investments are likely to pay off. Also, there has been a major, government focus on making sure that, internet connectivity, there are investments of internet connectivity across remote parts of Pakistan. The government of KP, for instance, has passed some kind of regulation that whenever roads are constructed in different parts of the province, there should be the option for optic fibers and internet connectivity along those roads. Any studies about impact on higher education, and what is the impact on workforce ultimately? Well, the impact on higher education. So there's two aspects to this. One is that at the higher education level, students are, if you're talking about universities, students are more likely to students are more likely to be able to learn themselves more successfully than at the lower grades. So, if the government and if higher education institutions are able to provide the right kind of infrastructure to make remote learning accessible, I think when it comes to higher education, there's a lot of possibilities of, that additional infrastructure making higher education more accessible to those students who live in areas where universities and colleges don't exist, who for cultural or other reasons are not able to step outside their houses to access universities, etc. Especially children with physical disabilities who for some reason or the other unfortunately our schooling infrastructure is not very disability friendly. So, this would provide opportunities for children with disabilities to access higher education from the comfort of their own home as well. Yes, so Fahad Azam has asked, is it correct that distance education didn't work as much as we expected, but probably the main reason was that there was more focus on synchronized learning in low-income countries, shouldn't be more focus on synchronous learning, so effective flow. Absolutely agree with that completely, Dr. Fahad. In low-income countries, there has been again, a major recognition that, technology, which could have been a major bridge between the have-nots and the haves, instead of becoming the great equalizer during COVID, actually became a great divider, right? We saw that private school students, my daughter, Zoom classes, interactive, fewer students in classes. I mean, she was able to continue. Not as effective as obviously, in-school instruction, but she's 6.5 years old, and she was able to benefit from interactive Zoom classes, right? And some schools even developed applications for the students to be able to access on their parents' laptops or their own iPads, right? But what about school systems that didn't have those facilities and didn't have the money to invest? These are not just government schools, but low-fee private schools, where parents do pay a fee, so but the returns to that investment is fairly low because those schools couldn't invest in proper remote learning. And even if they could, the students in those schools didn't really have access to the technology. Are you in favor of online education instead of physical? So I think they can both complement each other quite well. Certain years, when children are not only, when they're developing socialization skills, when they need to, learn more about sharing, interaction, and team spirit, I think physical in-school education is really very important because it doesn't just teach you the curriculum, but it teaches you a whole bunch of other skills necessary for us to become, successful members of society. You learn leadership, etc. Also, which helps, when you go into the job market. However, online education also has its major advantages. For instance, now when you look at innovations in, edtech, gaming, people are learning through gaming, people are learning through really exciting interactive, applications, and those kind of help children feel like they're actually, engaged in play while they're learning. And in areas where, schools are not available, we see that in large parts of Pakistan, you don't even have primary schools. And, if, there is a way to provide that kind of internet connectivity with the government, private schools can provide low-fee tablets, etc., online education does replace physical education. But I think as we grow older and as we become more adept at self-learning, online education is a really strong instrument. Well, how does a vaccine play a role in COVID-19? I would hope that people, my personal opinion, very personally, is that, people do get vaccinated and, they protect not just themselves, but people around them. So, hopefully will bring at least the extreme COVID cases lower. But we can justify that something is better than nothing. Why only the education is most affected and criticized, not the shopping, public transports and others? Yes, obviously the economy has taken a big hit, right? Because of public transport not being available, because of, income being lost, because of people not able to go into, physically into shops. Education is most affected because, schools are a major socialization ground, right? So the one way to kind of stop the pandemic from spreading was to close schools. And, now that in Pakistan, especially until, children, school-age children, especially at the primary school level, do have access to vaccines, I think, we will see inconsistencies in school openings and school closures. We know the advantages and disadvantages. What is the way forward as this is the new normal? Well, I think the way forward is that, we need to have contingency planning. Nobody ever expected this, but we have to have contingency planning for, God forbid, future events where in-person interaction is not possible. And I think when it comes to education, the sector that I'm most familiar with, we have seen government investing very, very heavily in distance learning, not just at the federal level, but interactions with provincial governments have also shown that. So hopefully, an outcome of this, long-term impact is a more resilient and nimble education sector where, God forbid, if, there is an impact on in-person schooling, the government will be able to respond more quickly. And, this is not just to do with, health pandemics, but we saw what happened during the earthquake in 2005, where, thousands of students were affected by, when the earthquake damaged their schools. That in itself, an initial study back then, I remember, showed that it resulted in 14 months of learning loss for the students whose schools were closed down. So hopefully the government understands the need to be a little more resilient and have contingency planning. Another question, as educators, what are our plans? So as educators, one of the things that the private education community and development partners to the government, I think, have invested very, very heavily. There's some major World Bank, USAID, British programs to help the government of Pakistan develop really good, high quality learning content, to come up with low cost ways of distributing that content, and also to look at the way schooling is conducted in Pakistan, coming up with investments in infrastructure that prevent overcrowding, multi-grade classrooms, allow some kind of spacing between the students and that obviously also helps learning levels, right? The less crowded a classroom is, the more space that students have, the more interaction a teacher has with his students, because there are fewer students. All these impact high learning levels. Okay, so this is a really good question again. What steps have been taken by stakeholders and governments to train teachers to use online tools? I think this is a really fabulous question. And so we see that, right? We see two things happening. We see that the government experimenting with remote teacher training programs as well, where the teacher training is delivered via tablets, etc. So the teachers learn how to use technology as well. And you would be happy to hear that a lot of provincial governments, while they weren't able to do it now, but once the system is coming back online, some kind of continuity and predictability, a lot of teacher development programs are focusing on online education and instruction to enable teachers, especially at the higher grade levels, to provide interactive instruction to students who may not be in physical proximity, but maybe at a distance, right? So whether it is through online classes, or whether it is through just putting material online, to allow students to engage with that material. And again, the comment on poor people having no communication system for attending classes, this is the biggest setback of COVID. Again, like I said, technology, which was supposed to be the great equalizer, proved to be the great divider during COVID. And I think that's where the emphasis comes in on making sure that, we do invest heavily in technology, and governments do that, right? Pakistan telecom sector, again, yes, it is promising. What about psychomotor skills? This is something that I spoke about earlier, is that one of the biggest setbacks of online education and biggest advantages of physical education is that children develop a lot more than, knowledge against the curriculum. So this is about it from me. Happy, if there's any other questions, but, hope you found this engaging and meaningful. Tanya, would you like to come in at this point?
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your time and valuable insights, sharing all the insights with us. We will be sharing the feedback link on the emails of every learner who have joined us today. And do let us know about the session And as we always say, this is not the end, rather, this is the beginning of a new journey with Ma'am Izza. So, on your feedback, we will be coming up with more sessions. So, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Ma'am, for your time.
Thank you. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Thank you. It was a great learning experience for me too, to be able to organize all this content in this presentation. So thank you very much.